in the restless, neon-soaked expanses of Los Angeles, where endless traffic, sleepless nights, and glittering illusions hide the quiet tragedies unfolding behind closed doors. 32-year-old Damon Hart drifted through life with a bitterness he carried like a permanent shadow, a resentment that festered beneath every conversation, every failed relationship, and every moment when he felt the world was slipping beyond his control. And although Damon often claimed loudly and proudly that he hated women, insisting that they were manipulative, untrustworthy, and only interested in exploiting men, his harsh words masked wounds he never dared to confront. Wounds rooted in childhood neglect, abandonment, and a long pattern of relationships that he sabotaged before they could sabotage him. Yet fate led him into the orbit of Riley Vaughn, a gentle and soft-spoken transgender woman whose quiet resilience and artistic spirit seemed to glow in stark contrast to Damon's cynical worldview. And despite all the walls he had built around himself, Damon felt an unexpected pull toward her the day they met in a downtown cafe where Riley worked part-time, and she remembered him only because he had ordered the same black coffee 3 days in a row but never smiled. And something about her steady kindness, the grace in her voice, and the easy warmth in her eyes made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years, sparking a relationship neither of them anticipated, but both were drawn into. And while their early days together carried the sweetness and discovery that new love often brings, slow mornings filled with laughter, late-night conversations on rooftops, long drives through quiet neighborhoods, they also carried early signs of dangers Riley hoped were simply misunderstandings. Moments when Damon's insecurities surfaced in the form of subtle interrogations, checking who she was texting, asking where she had been, and questioning small details with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Though she always responded with honesty and patience because she believed people were capable of healing when shown compassion. And she believed Damon simply needed time to grow out of old fears and harmful beliefs. But Damon's insecurities deepened instead of softening, fueled by his internal conflict over dating someone he didn't fully understand and by his toxic need to control the person he loved. And as weeks turned into months, the apartment they shared, once a haven of soft music, drying paintbrushes, and shared meals, slowly transformed into a space filled with tension and unspoken dread, especially as Damon's paranoia grew stronger each time Riley's phone vibrated, each time she stepped out to meet a friend, each time she came home late from work. And while Riley reassured him repeatedly, showing him messages, inviting him to meet her friends, explaining her schedule, nothing seemed to quiet the storm inside him, because the real enemy was never her behavior. It was the insecurity he refused to confront within himself. And as Damon spent more nights brooding in the dark, scrolling through toxic online spaces where bitterness was encouraged and misogynistic beliefs were celebrated, he began adopting those poisonous ideologies with alarming devotion, finding validation for every suspicion, every jealous thought, every fear of abandonment he had buried deep inside him. And these online echo chambers fanned the flames of his delusions, convincing him that Riley's kindness was manipulation, that her independence was disrespect, and that her growing confidence was a threat to his fragile sense of control, all of which escalated the tension at home to a near constant state of conflict, where Riley pleaded for peace while Damon escalated every misunderstanding into a battle, until their relationship teetered on the edge of collapse, not because Riley stopped loving him, but because Damon was becoming someone capable of harming the very person who cared most for him. And in the shadows of that little LA apartment, under dim lights and unspoken fears, the seeds of a tragedy were quietly taking roots that neither of them fully understood, yet but would soon bear devastating consequences that would echo far beyond their walls. Riley Vaughn had always believed that patience could heal anything, that kindness could soften even the hardest hearts. And in the early months of her relationship with Damon Hart, she clung tightly to that belief, hoping that the man who sometimes held her with trembling vulnerability was not the same man who frequently let suspicion cloud his eyes. Yet by the time autumn settled over Los Angeles, with its hazy sunsets and cooling winds, Riley began noticing that Damon's moods were becoming increasingly unpredictable, shifting from forced calm to seething hostility without warning. And although she tried to understand the source of his anger, asking gentle questions, offering reassurance, reminding him that she loved him, Damon interpreted every attempt at communication as criticism, believing Riley was analyzing him, judging him, or preparing to leave him, fueling an internal narrative built entirely on fear rather than truth. And this paranoia seemed to tighten its grip on him day by day, manifesting in little ways at first, like when he insisted that Riley share her phone password, or when he questioned why she smiled at a barista, or when he accused her of seeking attention simply for posting a picture of her artwork online. But soon these small incidents evolved into long, exhausting confrontations that drained Riley emotionally, as she struggled to balance compassion with her need to feel safe, especially when Damon began pacing the apartment at night, muttering to himself about betrayal, trust, and loyalty, sometimes whispering things he never explained, leaving Riley lying awake in the dark with her heart pounding and her breath held tight, unsure whether to comfort him or protect herself. And even though she spoke to her closest friends about Damon's behavior, describing his sudden interrogations, the way he combed through her texts, the way he became angry when she dressed nicely for work, they gently suggested boundaries, time apart, or couples therapy. But Riley, carrying both love and hope, believed Damon's wounds were old, deep, and simply needed someone to stay long enough to heal them. A belief rooted in her own history of being misunderstood and judged, making her more tolerant of pain than she should have been. And when Damon apologized after every explosive argument, holding her tightly, swearing he would change, promising that his anger came from fear of losing her, Riley chose forgiveness because she saw flashes of the man she fell for. The man who listened to her stories, who watched her paint for hours, who cooked breakfast on slow Sundays, who told her she made him feel alive in ways he couldn't explain. But beneath those apologies, Damon's resentment was quietly growing, fed by the same online communities he visited late at night, forums filled with men who fueled one another's bitterness, encouraging jealousy, control, and distrust. And every post Damon read seemed to validate his dark thoughts, convincing him that Riley's independence was disrespect, that her friendships were threats, that her identity made their relationship a weakness he needed to manage. And soon Damon stopped discussing his fears with her at all, choosing instead to simmer silently, watching her movements, analyzing her tone of voice, reading hidden meanings into her smiles and her silences, until Riley began to feel as if she were sharing her home with two versions of him, the affectionate partner she loved and the unpredictable storm she feared. And one late evening, when Riley returned from her cafe shift, exhausted and paint-stained, she found Damon sitting in the dark living room, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of his phone screen, his expression blank and distant. And when she asked gently if he was okay, he responded with a cold, clipped voice she barely recognized, telling her he knew she was lying, that she had someone new, that he wasn't stupid, despite her thinking he was. And Riley, stunned and shaking, tried to explain that she had stayed late helping a coworker close the shop, even showing him the time cards and messages. But Damon dismissed everything with a wave of his hand, pacing the room and muttering about betrayal until Riley finally sat down, buried her face in her hands, and cried not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion, heartbreak, and the heavy realization that love alone could not save someone determined to see the world through the lens of fear. And as Damon watched her cry, a part of him felt shame, but a much louder part felt justified, believing her tears were manipulative, that her explanations were excuses, solidifying the dangerous belief that everything he feared was true. And in that dimly lit room, filled with tension, mistrust, and the faint sound of Riley's quiet sobs, the distance between them grew into something jagged and irreversible, setting the foundation for a tragedy neither of them could yet name, but both could feel tightening like a wire around their fragile, breaking relationship. As the relationship between Damon Hart and Riley Vaughn progressed, the tension that had quietly simmered for months began to erupt into increasingly volatile confrontations, with Riley desperately attempting to maintain calm and Damon increasingly convinced that the entire world, including the person he supposedly loved, was conspiring against him. And one Friday evening, when Riley attended a small art community gathering she had been invited 2 weeks prior, the incident that would ultimately accelerate the unraveling of their lives began. Because, despite Riley sending Damon multiple reassuring texts throughout the evening and sharing photos of her work and her surroundings, Damon's paranoia escalated unchecked, his mind turning each harmless interaction, each kind word from friends, each laugh shared with strangers into imagined betrayals. And as he sat alone in their apartment, Damon replayed every previous argument, every perceived slight, and every moment of supposed disloyalty, weaving a dark, elaborate narrative in which Riley was intentionally deceiving him, hiding her feelings, and planning to abandon him at the first opportunity. And this obsessive thought process consumed his waking hours, leaving him emotionally exhausted, yet unable to stop. And when Riley returned home that night, glowing with pride after selling a painting, Damon refused to acknowledge her accomplishment, instead erupting in a sudden torrent of accusations, his voice echoing through the small apartment as he claimed she had been unfaithful, manipulating him, humiliating him, and plotting behind his back. And although Riley responded with her usual calm, measured explanations detailing her night, the messages she had sent, and her sincere intentions, Damon's mind had already decided that she was lying. and his perception of reality became increasingly skewed as he projected his insecurities onto her every gesture, tone, and word. And even when Riley tried to redirect the conversation, offering a gentle hug or asking to sit down and talk it through, Damon's anger intensified. His thoughts racing with imagined betrayals and injustices that no amount of reasoning could penetrate. And in those moments, Riley began to realize that she was not just facing jealousy, but a dangerous combination of obsession and distorted thinking. Because Damon's fixation had crossed the threshold from emotional insecurity into a psychological pattern where control, fear, and suspicion dictated his behavior rather than logic, empathy, or love. And as the argument continued, slamming doors, shouted accusations, and tears became their shared language. Each interaction reinforcing Damon's self-imposed narrative that he was a victim and Riley an enemy. And the more she tried to clarify and reassure, the more he perceived manipulation, and the more he perceived manipulation, the more intense and unpredictable his reactions became, creating a vicious cycle that neither could break. And the apartment that once held the warmth of their tentative love, where Riley's exhaustion and fear were met with Damon's constant scrutiny and unpredictable rage, and the entire dynamic escalated to the point where Riley, despite her careful patience and kindness, began to feel trapped, powerless, and aware that she could no longer rely on love alone to prevent the situation from spiraling further. And although no one could have predicted that Damon's obsession would ultimately lead to physical violence, the warning signs were clear in every overreaching accusation, every unjustified interrogation, every moment he isolated her emotionally. And as she lay awake that night, tears staining her pillow, Riley understood that the relationship had crossed into territory she could not fix, no matter how much she wanted to, and that the next days, weeks, and months could bring consequences neither of them could undo, because Damon's fixation had become a storm ready to break, a culmination of fear, insecurity, rage, and misdirected hatred that was now fully entwined with his perception of Riley, making every gesture, every word, every smile from her a potential threat, and setting the stage for a tragedy that would irreversibly alter both their lives in ways that could not be repaired with apologies, patience, or love alone. Marcus sat alone in the dim glow of the cheap motel lamp, his breath loud in the silence as he stared at the cracked mirror reflecting a version of himself he could barely recognize anymore. Torn between the rage brewing inside him and the fear of losing control permanently, he replayed the last argument he'd had with Liana, her voice trembling yet defiant as she told him she couldn't live with someone who loved her only when he felt powerful and hated her whenever his paranoia consumed him. And the memory twisted like barbed wire in his stomach, feeding the jealousy that had grown like a tumor inside his mind over the past weeks. Because Marcus had convinced himself that every stranger who glanced at her, every person who smiled at her, every old friend who texted her, was secretly trying to take her away from him, and although he never admitted it out loud, he knew deep down that his hatred for himself, his failures, his broken ego, his inability to trust was what pushed him to lash out and claim he hated women, when in reality he hated being vulnerable, hated being left behind, hated feeling small. And Liana, with her courage and openness, made him feel exposed in ways he didn't know how to handle, especially after she confronted him about his growing temper and late-night drinking, telling him that if he didn't get help, she would walk away because she deserved a life where she wasn't constantly afraid of the man she loved. And that sentence haunted him with a mixture of shame and fury as he sat on the motel bed gripping the blanket, like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. But the more he thought about her words, the more his mind twisted them into something darker. Convinced that she was planning to leave him for someone else, convinced that she had already moved on, convinced that every moment she spent outside their apartment was another betrayal. And in that paranoia, he decided to call her, even though his hands trembled violently, listening to the phone ring and imagining her ignoring it on purpose. But when she answered with her soft "Marcus, please, not tonight," he exploded, accusing her of lying, of cheating, of humiliating him. And she tried to calm him down, telling him she was just at a late shift and would talk when she got home. But the jealousy pulsed so fiercely that he slammed the phone down and grabbed his jacket, storming out of the motel into the cold night, as if the frigid air could cool the rage boiling in him. Yet every step toward their apartment only made his thoughts louder. By the time he reached the parking lot beneath their building, his mind had already constructed a scenario where Liana was laughing with someone else, touching someone else, giving someone else the tenderness she used to give him. And he rushed up the stairs with the pounding determination of a man who believed he was about to catch someone in the act, even though deep down he knew he was chasing ghosts of his own insecurities. But when he burst into the apartment, the lights were dim, the room was quiet, and Liana was alone at the kitchen table, eating takeout after a long shift, looking exhausted and sad rather than guilty. Yet Marcus's vision had already narrowed into a tunnel of suspicion and panic, and even though she stood and approached him gently, telling him she loved him but couldn't survive this constant fear, he interpreted her kindness as pity, her calm voice as condescension, her honesty as rejection. And that poisonous mix detonated inside him like a final spark in a room full of gasoline, pushing him toward a decision he could never undo. As he stepped closer, his chest heaving, Liana realized something was wrong, truly wrong, and backed away, pleading for him to breathe, to think, to understand that she wasn't leaving. But Marcus, blinded by the storm inside him, felt only the crushing dread of abandonment and the compulsive urge to stop the pain before it consumed him completely. And in that tragic moment, his jealousy transformed into violence, closing the door on the man he used to be and opening the path to the crime that would define the rest of his life. Liana stood frozen as Marcus stepped deeper into the kitchen, the tension thickening the air like smoke. Her heart beat loud in her ears as she tried to understand whether this was another one of his emotional storms or something far more dangerous. Because the expression on his face wasn't just anger anymore. It was the look of a man who had lost his grip on reality and was clinging to whatever twisted thoughts his paranoia fed him. And she raised her hands slowly, speaking softly, telling him she wasn't leaving, wasn't cheating, wasn't doing anything except trying to help him heal. But her voice trembled despite her efforts to stay calm, and Marcus interpreted that tremble not as fear but as guilt, as a confession she was too afraid to say out loud. And his jealousy burst like a dam breaking after weeks of pressure. flooding his mind with every dark scenario he had imagined while sitting alone in the motel, making him believe that Liana had betrayed him emotionally even if she hadn't done anything in reality. But Liana, noticing the agitation spreading through him like wildfire, tried to reach for her phone slowly to call anyone who could help de-escalate the situation. Yet Marcus saw the movement as another betrayal, convinced she was calling her supposed other man, and he rushed toward her so suddenly she stumbled back against the table, knocking over the takeout container as she pleaded with him to stop, telling him he was scaring her, telling him they could talk, telling him nothing had happened and nothing ever would. But Marcus heard none of it, because the sound of his own thoughts drowned out her words, echoing louder and sharper than her desperate voice, repeating over and over that she was going to leave him, that she had already left him in her heart, that she cared more for someone else, and every step he took felt like falling deeper into a tunnel where only his rage existed, a tunnel with no space for truth, compassion, or logic. Liana managed to slip past him and make it halfway toward the hallway, intending to lock herself in the bedroom until Marcus calmed down, but he caught her arm before she could escape, pulling her back with a force that shocked even him, and she cried out in pain, not because he intended to hurt her, but because he was no longer thinking as a man who loved her. He was thinking as a man possessed by fear and resentment. And when she said his name with tears in her eyes, begging him to let go and breathe, something inside him snapped, a sharp fracture in whatever conscience he had left, and he shoved her away in a panicked reflex, not realizing how close she was to the edge of the counter until she hit it hard and collapsed to the floor, the impact knocking the air from her lungs and leaving her stunned, and Marcus, horrified, for a split second, dropped to his knees beside her, shaking, whispering her name repeatedly, as if saying it enough times would undo what had just happened. But the moment he saw her struggling for breath, confusion and panic collided inside him, twisting into yet another paranoid assumption that she was pretending, manipulating him, trying to make him feel guilty so she could escape. And instead of calling for help, like any rational person would, he convinced himself he needed to stop her from screaming, from running, from choosing someone else. And as he pressed his hand over her mouth to silence her pleas, tears streamed down his face, because a part of him knew he was crossing a line he could never walk back from. But the stronger part, the broken, jealous part, insisted this was the only way to keep her. And Liana, terrified and fighting to breathe, stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak that cut deeper than any words she could have spoken. Yet her strength was fading quickly as Marcus's grip tightened, driven not by hatred but by the delusion that losing her would mean losing the last fragment of his fragile identity. And when her body finally went still, when the kitchen fell silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing, the gravity of what he had done hit him like a physical blow, leaving him kneeling on the floor beside the woman he claimed to love, shaking uncontrollably as the reality settled in that his jealousy hadn't just damaged their relationship, had destroyed it entirely, leaving him alone with the irreversible weight of the crime that would change everything. For several long seconds, Marcus remained frozen on the cold kitchen tiles, staring at Liana's motionless body as if waiting for her to inhale, blink, or whisper his name. But the silence settled around him like a thick fog, suffocating and absolute, and the reality that he had crossed the final unforgivable line struck him with such force that his hands began to shake uncontrollably. Yet, instead of reaching for a phone or shouting for help, he stumbled backward until his spine hit the refrigerator, sliding down it with his breath caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp. And all he could think was that this couldn't be happening, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that he only wanted her to stop running, stop arguing, stop making him feel like he wasn't enough. But as the minutes ticked by and the initial shock faded, another darker thought crept into his mind, the fear of what would happen to him if anyone found out, the fear of handcuffs, prosecutors, headlines, and a lifetime defined by the single worst moment of his existence. And that fear began shaping his actions more than the guilt did, pushing him into a frantic, adrenaline-fueled state as he crawled toward Liana again, checking her pulse even though he already knew the truth, whispering apologies to a woman who could no longer hear them, telling her he loved her, telling her he didn't mean it, telling her he wished she would wake up and scold him one more time. But the stillness of her skin made every word echo back at him like a cruel reminder that he had become the very thing he always swore he wasn't. Eventually, survival instinct overpowered the grief, twisting his chest, and he stood up on shaky legs, pacing the kitchen as his mind raced through a storm of desperate thoughts. He left now. Would anyone connect him to the crime? Would neighbors hear anything? Would anyone know she planned to leave him? Would the police believe it was an accident? Could he stage it as something else? Or should he simply disappear from the city entirely? But his spiraling mental state made every idea feel both possible and impossible, and the panic tightened around him like an invisible fist, squeezing until he struggled to breathe. He moved quickly, almost mechanically, wiping surfaces he believed he had touched, though his frantic state made him miss dozens more. And when he accidentally knocked over a framed photo of them smiling during better days, the glass shattered across the floor, snapping him out of his haze long enough for him to kneel and stare at their frozen happiness, wondering when things had changed, when jealousy had replaced love, when fear had replaced trust, and whether there had ever been a version of their relationship that wasn't doomed from the beginning, due to his inability to believe he deserved someone like her. But guilt quickly transformed back into self-preservation as he remembered that someone might come home, someone might knock, someone might call. So he moved to the window slowly, scanning the parking lot for witnesses, heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. After several tense moments of silence, he forced himself to gather supplies: a bedsheet, gloves, trash, bags, grabbing whatever he thought would help him hide the evidence. And though his hands trembled so violently he could barely grip the fabric, he pushed forward because he believed he no longer had a choice, believed he had passed the point where confession or help could save him, believed that covering up the crime was his only path to survival, even if a part of him knew the truth would eventually claw its way to the surface. As he wrapped Liana carefully, almost tenderly, as if making up for all the cruelty he had shown her, tears streamed down his face, splashing onto the sheet as he whispered broken apologies into the empty air. And when he finally lifted her, the weight of her body felt heavier than anything he had ever carried, not because of its physical mass, but because of the guilt attached to it. Guilt that wrapped around him like chains he knew he would never escape, no matter how far he ran. And as he carried her toward the door, the apartment that once held their quiet routines and tender moments now felt like a stage for a tragedy he had written with his own hands, closing behind him with a soft click that marked not just the end of a relationship, but the beginning of a descent. He could no longer stop. Marcus stepped into the hallway with Liana's lifeless body cradled in his arms, his breath shallow and uneven as he listened for any sound that might betray his presence, terrified that a neighbor might open their door and see him moving through the dimly lit corridor with the trembling desperation of a man who knew he was committing the second, irreversible act of the night. And every creak of the old building felt amplified, echoing down the hall as though the walls themselves were witnessing his shame. But when he reached the stairwell and found it empty, he hurried downward, nearly slipping twice because his legs shook so violently he could barely hold himself upright. Yet he forced himself to continue, driven by that same frantic instinct that insisted survival was still possible if he moved quickly enough, quietly enough, invisibly enough. By the time he reached the parking lot behind the building, the cold air hit him with such intensity that he had to pause to steady his breathing, the weight in his arms dragging at both his muscles and his conscience, making him wish for just a moment that he could rewind time to a version of the evening where he simply walked away. But the regret was useless now, and he pushed forward toward his old sedan, constantly scanning the shadows as if someone might be lurking there, with a camera ready to capture the truth he desperately needed to bury. And when he opened the back door and gently lowered her body inside, the sheer finality of closing the door afterward nearly sent him spiraling again, but fear kept him focused. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and for several long seconds he couldn't bring himself to start the engine, his mind replaying every moment of their last hours together like a broken film, her pleading eyes, her trembling voice, the sound of her body hitting the floor, and each memory stabbed at him with a guilt he knew he couldn't outrun forever. Yet the terror of prison, of headlines, of judgment, pushed him to finally turn the key, and the car's low rumble sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. He drove with trembling hands, glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds, as though expecting to see flashing blue lights behind him. But the streets were empty, giving him the illusion that fate was granting him one last chance to escape. And he latched onto that hope recklessly as he headed toward the industrial outskirts of the city, a place he used to visit in his darker moments, just to be alone, where no one asked questions, where the air smelled of rust and abandoned dreams. And it was there he planned to do whatever was necessary to erase the evidence of his crime, even though the thought made his stomach twist violently. The farther he drove, the more his paranoia grew. Every approaching pair of headlights made him tense. Every passing car felt like a threat. Every intersection a potential checkpoint where the truth might suddenly collapse onto him. Yet, somehow he reached the desolate stretch of warehouses without being stopped, and he pulled into an empty lot where the only light came from a flickering street lamp that buzzed like an insect, its weak glow casting long shadows across the gravel. He parked near a cluster of dumpsters, his heart thudding painfully in his chest as he stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. And when he opened the back door again, The sight of Liana's still form wrapped in the bedsheet made him freeze with a wave of crushing remorse. Because no matter how much he tried to justify his actions with panic and fear, the truth was that he had destroyed someone who had loved him despite all his flaws. And now he was about to hide her as though she were nothing more than a mistake he wanted to forget. But survival instinct overpowered grief once again, and he gathered the sheet, lifting her with trembling arms and carrying her toward the shadows behind the dumpsters, each step echoing with the knowledge that this moment would mark him forever, that no matter how deeply he buried her, the guilt would follow him like a ghost he could never escape. Yet he continued anyway, because fear had become stronger than conscience, stronger than love, stronger than every part of him that still wished desperately for redemption as he disappeared into the darkness with her. Marcus stood in the cold, desolate lot behind the abandoned warehouses, clutching the sheet-trapped body of the woman he once swore he would never hurt. The silence around him, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind moving across the gravel. And with every step he took into the darkness, his mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to call someone, to confront the truth instead of burying it. But fear had a stranglehold on him, stronger than any moral instinct he had left, pushing him deeper into the industrial maze where no one ever looked twice at shadows. And he paused near a rusted metal container, catching his breath as panic and exhaustion collided in his chest, making him sway as though his own body struggled to support the weight of his actions. He knelt down and gently lowered Liana's body onto the cold ground, his fingers trembling as he loosened the edges of the sheet, not to see her face, but to make sure she hadn't moved, hadn't somehow come back to life to tell him it wasn't too late. And when the cloth slipped just enough for him to glimpse a strand of her hair, his throat tightened painfully, because in that tiny detail he saw every moment she had comforted him, every moment she had forgiven him, every moment she had believed he could be better. And the crushing weight of betrayal nearly drove him to collapse beside her. But he forced the sheet back into place quickly, afraid that if he saw her face again, he might not have the strength to continue with what he had convinced himself was necessary. He stood abruptly, wiping his hands on his jeans as though he could rid himself of the guilt clinging to his skin, and he looked around the lot with frantic eyes, searching for anything that could help him hide what he had done. A pile of debris, a drainage ditch, a loose patch of earth, yet every option felt impossible, too exposed, too risky, too much like a reminder that he was now a man trying to erase another human being from the world. And the absurdity of it all made him laugh for a brief, broken second. Before the sound twisted into a guttural sob, he quickly choked back. The flickering street lamp above him buzzed louder, casting erratic shadows across his face and making him feel as though even the light was judging him, exposing him, screaming for someone to witness the sin unfolding beneath it. So he dragged Liana's body farther into the shadows, behind a row of dumpsters and concrete blocks, a place where no one would bother to look unless they had a reason. And as he knelt again, digging through debris with his bare hands in a frantic attempt to create some kind of shallow cover, he kept whispering to himself that it was temporary, that he would move her later, that this was only a first step. But deep down he knew he was lying to himself, the same way he had lied to her about changing, about getting better, about being someone who could love without destroying. When he finally had enough space cleared to conceal her even partially, he placed her down gently, almost reverently, as though his trembling hands could somehow offer comfort to a body that could no longer feel anything. And he hesitated for a long moment, staring at the shape of the sheet, and realizing that this was the last time he would ever be near her, the last time he would ever see even the outline of the person who had once believed in him. And the finality of that truth carved into him more sharply than any blade could, leaving him feeling hollow and unstable as he covered her with debris, dirt, and cold metal scraps until the sheet was no longer visible. The wind picked up, scattering dust around him and deepening the shadows, and Marcus, trembling and drenched in sweat despite the cold, stepped back to survey his makeshift attempt at concealment, knowing it was sloppy, temporary, and nowhere near enough to erase what he had done. Yet, convincing himself it would buy him a little time, enough to think, enough to run, enough to decide what kind of coward he would become, now that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. As he turned away and walked back toward his car, the night felt heavier than ever, pressing down on him with the weight of the truth buried behind him. A truth that he knew, no matter how deeply he hid, it would eventually claw its way back into the light. Marcus drove away from the abandoned lot with his heart pounding so violently that it almost drowned out the sound of the engine, his hands clammy on the steering wheel as he forced himself not to look in the rear-view mirror, even though every cell in his body begged him to, convinced that if he glanced back even once, he might see Liana's covered form sitting upright in the back seat or standing somewhere in the darkness, silently watching him run from the consequences of his own destruction. And the fear gnawing at him only tightened as he merged onto the empty road leading back into the city, where every passing streetlight illuminated the suffocating truth that he wasn't escaping anything. He was dragging the weight of his crime with him like a shadow that would never detach. He kept driving aimlessly, turning down random streets with trembling fingers, unsure whether he was trying to hide or trying to punish himself by staying in motion until exhaustion overtook him. But with each passing block, his paranoia grew sharper, twisting his thoughts into jagged illusions where every dark sedan looked like an unmarked police car. Every pedestrian looked like someone who recognized him. Every billboard seemed to accuse him. And soon the emotional noise in his chest became so loud that he pulled into a deserted gas station parking lot, shutting off the engine as he curled forward and pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the glass. And for several long minutes he remained there, suspended in a torment of guilt, fear, and disbelief, wondering how he had become the kind of man capable not only of killing the person he loved, but of hiding her like a secret he never intended to face. Eventually, he forced himself to sit upright, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans as he tried to gather the fragments of his scattered thoughts, because he knew he needed a plan, something, anything to keep himself from unraveling completely. And he reached into the glove compartment with shaking hands, searching for his phone. But when he unlocked it, he was confronted with a home screen filled with photos of Liana smiling, laughing, leaning into him on nights when they thought their love could conquer anything. And the sight of her joy he had helped destroy sent a tremor through him so violent that he nearly dropped the device. But instead of turning it off, he opened their message history, scrolling through months of conversations that seemed innocent and distant now, as though they were written by two strangers rather than the broken ghost he had become and the woman whose voice he would never hear again. He reread her last message. "We'll talk when I get home, okay? Please just try to breathe." And the tenderness in her words crushed him, making him whisper a choked apology into the empty car, as though the night air might carry it back to her. But no amount of regret could erase what he had done. And after a long, painful moment, he tossed the phone aside, gripping the steering wheel again as he realized with a sinking certainty that he couldn't stay in the city. Not with the possibility of someone finding the body, not with neighbors remembering their arguments, not with the guilt threatening to tear him apart. He needed to disappear before the truth surfaced. Yet, as he started the car again and pulled back onto the road, another fear burrowed into him, the fear that running wouldn't just make him a fugitive. It would make him a monster in the eyes of everyone who ever knew him. And that thought clawed through his mind until he finally pulled over on the side of a quiet highway, stepping out of the car to gasp for fresh air as the cool wind whipped against his face, grounding him for a brief, fragile moment. He looked up at the sky, expecting darkness to match the chaos inside him, but instead he saw a stretch of stars glimmering indifferently above him, and the contrast beauty above. Horror inside nearly broke him as he realized that the world would go on without Liana, without him, without the truth of what had happened tonight. And that painful insignificance made him feel even more alone, even more unmoored, even more desperate to find some sense of control. So he returned to the car, gripping the door frame tightly, as he whispered to himself that he would leave the city, start over somewhere new, pretend the past never happened. But even as he made the decision, he knew deep down that no matter how far he drove, no matter how convincingly he tried to rebuild a different life, the memory of Hertha love, the fear, the final moments would haunt him like a permanent scar carved into his mind, a shadow he could never outrun. Marcus drove 4 hours along the empty highway with no destination, only the desperate belief that distance alone could save him from the truth that clung to him like a second skin. But as the sky shifted from deep black to the faint gray of approaching dawn, exhaustion gnawed at him with increasing intensity, forcing him to pull off at a deserted rest area where the silence felt heavy enough to crush him. And he sat motionless behind the wheel, staring at his trembling hands as though they belonged to someone else, someone who had made choices he never imagined himself capable of making. Yet, as the early morning light bled across the horizon, a strange clarity settled into his thoughts, the kind that emerges after a long night of running, and he realized with a sinking, suffocating certainty that no matter how far he fled, his mind would always drag him back to the moment everything shattered, replaying it endlessly until the weight of guilt eventually consumed whatever remained of his sanity. And that realization struck him harder than fear of arrest ever had, because for the first time he truly understood that escape wasn't freedom, was a sentence handed down by his own conscience, one he would serve every day for the rest of his life. He rested his head against the seat, breathing deeply as the chill of dawn seeped through the cracked window. And he thought about Liana not as the woman he had lost in a moment of violence, but as the woman who had once seen something worth loving in him, the woman whose gentle voice had soothed his darkest nights, whose patience had carried him through storms he couldn't navigate alone. And the memory of those quiet moments wrapped around him with a grief so sharp it made his chest ache, because he knew now that he had destroyed not only her life, but every good thing she had brought into his, leaving behind only a hollow version of himself that he barely recognized. As he sat there, the world slowly waking around him, he tried to picture what his future would look like if he continued running cheap motels. Fake names, constant paranoia, the fear of every knock on every door, and the image was so bleak, so suffocating, that he felt his resolve crumbling like ash in his hands, pushing him toward the idea he had been avoiding since the moment she fell silent, turning himself in, facing the consequences, surrendering to the justice he had tried so desperately to outrun. And although the thought frightened him more than anything, it also brought a strange sense of relief, like breathing for the first time after drowning for hours. He knew he could never undo what he had done, never bring her back, never apologize in a way that mattered, but he could at least stop lying to himself, stop pretending he was strong enough to shoulder the burden of hiding her death forever. And when he finally reached for his phone with trembling fingers, it wasn't out of panic or desperation, it was out of acceptance, a quiet understanding that the only way forward was to face the storm he had created. He dialed the police station number with hands so unsteady he nearly dropped the device, listening to the ringing echo in his ear like a countdown to a life he could no longer avoid. And when the dispatcher answered, asking in a calm, emotionless voice how she could assist him, Marcus felt his throat tighten, his voice catching before he managed to speak, confessing in a broken whisper that he needed to report something terrible, something he had done, something he could no longer bear alone. And as the dispatcher instructed him to stay where he was while units were sent to his location, he hung up slowly, staring out at the pale horizon with a strange mixture of dread and peace settling over him. He stepped out of the car, letting the cold morning air wash over him as he closed his eyes, imagining Liana's face for the last time, not in fear or pain, but in one of those quiet, gentle smiles she used to give him when she believed he could change. And even though the memory cut deep, it also softened the tremor in his chest as he realized that turning himself in was the first truly honest thing he had done in years. Within minutes, he heard the distant wail of sirens growing louder, and he stood still, hands visible, heart steady for the first time since the night began, ready to face the consequences, ready to carry the weight he should have carried all along. And as the police cars pulled into the rest area, with lights flashing across the pavement, Marcus took one last breath of freedom before whispering a final apology into the wind, knowing justice was the only ending left for a man who had loved too fiercely, feared too deeply, and broken everything he once held dear.